I'm receiving a groundbreaking news report. It's from the Bureau of Approved Opinions. Researchers have determined that the number one threat to progress in America, dads. Specifically young dads, young fathers. According to this completely made-up report, men who marry in their early 20s, raise large families, and read the Bible to their kids are, quote, disrupting national priorities like brunch, casual hookups, and endless Netflix subscriptions. The report recommends that men delay responsibility until at least age 38, after they've racked up 6 figures of debt, a mild porn addiction, and a deep, soul-sucking corporate career. You can't save the West by having a family, one anonymous college student was quoted as saying while sipping kombucha and tweeting about masculinity from his mom's basement. Meanwhile, in the real world, America's birth rate just hit another record low. We're not replacing ourselves. Fewer children, fewer families, fewer men stepping up. The elites call that progress, and sadly, there are some who claim to be on the right who are writing, telling young men that having children is a distraction, that we have to stop LARPing and having more children than we can afford. Truth is, this is how civilizations collapse. And they do. Societies collapse, but they actually never get done away with because something else usually returns. And that something is the patriarchy. The kind that marries young, has lots of children, trains them in righteousness, and builds a legacy that outlives the noise of modern rebellion. So, no, you won't save the West by walking away from family. You'll save it by filling your quiver and training up an army and trusting the Lord. On this episode, I'm going to respond to an article by someone claiming to be on the right and yet arguing that marriage and lots of kids are a distraction from the real battle. I'm going to make the case for why children aren't a distraction from saving the West. They're actually the hope of the West. So join me as we build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarchy.
Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser.
Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and mind, soul and strength, and serve the King of Kings. Lift high the cross of Christ, tread where his feet have trod. As brothers of the Son of Man, rise up, O men of God.
Behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. That was Psalm 127, verses 3 through 5. I am Pastor Joseph Spurgeon, and you are listening to the Patriarchy Podcast, a ministry of Sovereign King Church. You know, one of our most famous presidents in the history of this country, Abraham Lincoln, in 1861 famously said, "If you are a racist, I will attack you with the North." Wait. That's not the right quote. Actually, what Abraham did say was, "You can't believe everything you read on the internet." And that quote changed my life when I read that on Facebook. I want to start with a quote from another president. This was a real quote in December 16th, 2008. On CNN, in the midst of a financial crisis in which the government bailed out banks and auto manufacturers. So President George W. Bush said, "I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system." Right? He abandoned the free market in order to save the free market. Basically, the president said he had to abandon his core commitment in order to save his core commitment. So with that idea in mind, and also warning you, as Abraham Lincoln did, don't believe everything you read on the internet, I actually want to read to you a short article I came across making the rounds on social media earlier this summer. And the article is "It Must Stop." And it was put out by the American Post-Liberal. The article says this regarding its author, Blake Bordeaux. Says he's a student at the University of Virginia and he's 6'2". So that's all we know about the author. I'm not sure what his height has to do with that. Probably nothing. I'm actually quite suspicious, to be honest, anytime a college student begins to write about families and children. You know, once before I was married, and while I was in college, I had mentioned to a pastor I was feeling called to ministry. I was running from it, but he wanted to really help me, and so he asked me to put together a sermon and preach it. And I can't believe that I did this. And I hope there's no video of it, because I preached a sermon on how to raise children. Like, if I had a time machine, I'd just say, stop. You have no clue. Like, it had to be terrible. I saw this chart once that had it was XY graph. And on this side, going up and down, it was your confidence level of how to raise children. And on the bottom was your age. And so it starts super high around 18, 19. And then as you get 20s and you start having children, your confidence level goes. And then once you get older and you start having grandchildren, your confidence level goes back up again. So you always got to take with a grain of salt anytime anyone in college without a family begins to write on what you should do about family life. So we're already starting off with that. But, you know, a college student can get things right. And this is a post-liberal, so this is like, you don't want to call it conservative. They wouldn't like being called conservative. This is far right, if you will. And here's the article. He says, there is an all-out war for America being fought every day, but you would not know it if you looked at the TradCon right-wingers. We'll find out what he means by TradCon right-wing soon enough, but let's continue. He says this war is not an academic debate. It's not a Socratic seminar. And it's certainly not a Norman Rockwell painting of a Republican election with candidates or the back of a train trying to win the hearts and minds of voters. It's a bare knuckle, no street fight for total control over our public institutions. The victor wins the power to shape society. All right, well, I agree we are in a battle. We're in war. I agree it's not Norman Rockwell. The masks are off, if you will. We have the left that wants to kill us. In fact, he goes on, he says, on one side stands the secular left with abortionists, pornographers, Wall Street wealth worshippers. They ride the Lolita Express to private islands. They make movies that mock Christ. They write opinion pieces and policy papers disparaging faithful Christian families. These people want us broke, dead, and powerless. They think it is funny. Yeah, we see that. It's wicked. And then on the other side are the Christians. And it's imperative that we stick together. We are blessed, he says, with a crop of angry young men radicalized by the excesses of liberal America. They have rejected secularism and wholeheartedly embraced Orthodox traditional teaching. You know, and I've been encouraged by this as well, that young men are skewing more conservative. And I think they are waking up to how previous generations and even our culture have been very wicked and very harmful towards men. I don't think it's good that they stay merely angry, but that anger, we ought to be angry at wickedness. So we can be angry, but we ought not sin. He says these young men need to storm the gates of power. As Machiavelli and countless other theorists wrote, politics is an intra-elite power structure. Imagine how much good could be done if Christianity's new radicals used their zealotry to wrest control of the institutions away from the secular left. All right, so far, I think we probably agree somewhat with this. We can give little things here and there. But he's doing a good job. He's painting the political climate, the situation we find ourselves in. And again, I'm hopeful by what appears to be a surge in young men rejecting secularism. We'll see how it pans out. If it doesn't get co-opted into other stupid areas. But I want Christians to get control away from the left, and I want us to do what's good and right and take dominion. Well, anyways, that's so far so good. Let's keep reading. He says, much has been written about the consequences of declining birth rates. Countries with fewer people are less powerful. Okay, this is a very important point. In fact, this is actually what my talk today, this podcast is going. And the fact that, we are on steep declines of birth rates. They're way below what is replaceable. And it's going to be disastrous for the West. And so he's right to bring that up. But what's he going to do with that? Hopefully he ties this into what he's talking about. Well, he says the same principle applies to the top 10% of American society. We must increase the amount of our people entering the elite. The more friendly people we have in the highest echelons, the less vulnerable we become. Okay. So he's saying the low birth rate is bad, and also having low rates of people in upper society is bad. All right, but he's kind of using the birth rate thing as an example, but this is kind of our first clue that something's going to go off. But let's keep reading. He says, for decades, it seemed like we were held back by demographics. Older Christians lamented that churches were losing their youngest people to the world. Against all odds, we finally have the young soldiers that can fight this civilization battle, but we are wasting them. How are we wasting them? That's okay. Maybe we are. I do think older generations need to work hard to discipline and disciple the young men so that we're not wasting them. He says these young men are searching for direction, but they do not find wise counsel. Instead, they are led astray by the same people responsible for past losses. All right, I can see this happening. You can see, some of the older generations are having a hard time working out the situation that we're in, figuring that out, and don't really have good answers. But what's the problem, he thinks? Well, he says this, the trads tell them, go to trade school, marry in your teens, have more kids than you can afford. And right here is where the article begins to go off the rails. The rest of this article, and I'm not going to read it all, this young man constantly complains about people having more kids than they can afford. He uses that phrase over and over. And the thrust of his argument is that by encouraging young men to get married, have lots of children, we're taking them out of the fight. And so in order to protect West and the family, we need young men who are unconcerned with family to enter into the institutions. Again, this, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this next paragraph kind of sums the whole thing. He says, and I'm sorry to tell you, but you're not going to save the West by having a family. Only one person ever saved the West by having kids, and she only had one. This is the real world. We cannot afford to tell our best people to opt out of the fight, or to play dress up, or to have more kids than you can afford. There's that line again, it's found all throughout this. And so this young man is equating a man getting married, working hard, having a family, having lots of kids, as opting out of the fight. And you can hear, can't you, the disdain for children dripping from his pen. And good. I'm sure this young man means well, and he wants to see Western civilization defended and thrive. But doesn't this sound like we have to abandon the free market system to save the free market system? We have to abandon our principles to save the system. Like we need young men who are not going to have children. And this is already happening. This is the problem, which he brought up. The birth rates are low. So what do we make of this? Are you not going to save the West by having a family? Like, is that accurate? Will having a family hinder the cause of Jesus in our land? Is having a family incompatible with fighting in politics? Right? Does it having a family take you out of the battle? Or are families and lots of children actually the hope for the West? Are families actually the foundation of politics and all civilization? What I want to argue today is that actually having children, getting married, is how we fight. Not the only way, for sure, but it is part of the fight. If there is anything true, one bad article on the internet doesn't mean there are no good articles. So you can't believe some stuff you read on the internet. Back in 2009, foreignpolicy.com put out an excellent article entitled The Return of Patriarchy. And in this article, Philip Longman argues that in many advanced societies, fertility has fallen below replacement level. Of course, he was arguing this 2009. Our level in our country was hovering around replacement level. It's since gone down, especially since 2020. Now, what you should know is foreignpolicy.com is not post-liberal. Like it's certainly liberal. It's not a Christian magazine, though they may quote Christians. I'm not sure. Philip Longman is not. He's a demographic person, and he's a liberal. And he argues, again, when societies fall below replacement level, there's problems. He says this demographic decline is intimately tied to cultural and structural changes in family life, and it's disastrous. And if it continues, it leads to destruction, of the society. But what he suggests is that the only social system that has historically succeeded in sustaining high fertility and strong parent-child investment is the patriarchal family organization. And what he does is he walks through the history of different nations and empires, showing that when nations become wealthy, they begin to neglect having children. And at first, the governments actually encourage the lower infertility. There's the whole, well, we're overpopulated type thing. But then those governments start to realize that, as the Bible says, the glory of a king is in the multitude of people. But the problem is, by the time they find it out, it's often too late. And so they start to try to enact policies which some help but may not. Now, this doesn't mean the end of civilization. It just means the end of those elites who did not have children, right? The elites that go in and don't have children, well, it means the end of them. It often meant also the end of placing women in high-ranking offices. Another great article or essay was put out by a guy named Spurgeon, which documents the rise and falls of empires. And he talks about the late stage of an empire is when they become so wealthy and fat that, they're living in just great wealth. There's not a lot of work that can, a lot of hard labor. And because of that, women start leaving the homes, going into all of work, and then start taking over places of authority. They become attorneys and judges and politicians. And Sir John Glubb also recognizes what this author recognizes, that, well, as the birth rates lower and other problems happen, well, the elites who didn't have children, well, they start to fade out. And those women, well, it becomes dangerous for them. And they also stop falling into those high-ranking offices. Because what replaces it is patriarchy. Now, Sir John Glubb seems to be a little bit more on the side of, like, what comes next is going to be very painful, and whereas this current author, he actually just notices he doesn't give a whole lot of value on whether the painful part. He just talks about what replaces it. And what he says is the patriarchy, the return of the patriarchy. And then he defines it. And he actually defines it pretty broadly. Basically what he means is men who marry, have children, and take responsibility for their households. And women who invest in raising children, and together they enculturate into their children, they transmit values of family, honor, and legacy. And so the elites who abandon all that, they diminish. Their culture they built will fall down. Their empire, as Sir John Glubb would say, would be destroyed and be attacked or taken over by some other patriarchal, some other type of gung-ho group of people. In the Return of the Patriarchy article, he documents that he starts in Egypt, he shows in Greece. In fact, he writes, at least as long ago as ancient Greek and Roman times, many sophisticated members of society concluded that investing in children brought no advantage. Rather, children came to be seen as a costly impediment to self-fulfillment and worldly achievement. You might say they become a costly impediment to doing battle and civilization finding. I mean, that's worldly achievement too. Maybe a good kind, but still. He says, but though these attitudes led to the extinction of many individual families, they did not lead to the extinction of society as a whole. Instead, through a process of cultural evolution and a set of values and norms that can roughly be described as patriarchy, the patriarchy reemerges. Societies with high fertility grew in strength and number and began menacing those with lower fertility. In more and more places in the world, fast-breeding tribes morphed into nations and empires, and they swept away any remaining slow-breeding hunters and gatherers. It mattered that your warriors were fierce and valiant, but what mattered more, that you had lots of them. This was the lesson King Pyrrhus learned in the 3rd century BC, when he marched his Greek armies into the Italian peninsula and tried to take on the Romans. Pyrrhus initially prevailed at a great battle at Asculum, but it was, as they say, a Pyrrhic victory. And Pyrrhus could only conclude that another such victory over the Romans, and we are undone. That is, if they won any more battles like this, they would be defeated. Why? Because the Romans were procreating far more rapidly than the Greeks, and they could keep pouring in reinforcements even if they lost a battle. He said it was as from a fountain continually flowing out of the city. Hopelessly outnumbered, Pyrrhus went on to lose the war and Greece after falling into a long era of population decline, and they eventually became a looted colony of Rome. Like today's modern well-fed nations, both ancient Greece and Rome eventually found that their elites had lost interest in the often dreary chores of family life. In our time, all Greece was visited by the dearth of children and the general decay of population, lamented the Greek historian Polybius around 140 BC, just as Greece was giving in to Roman domination. This evil grew up as rapidly and without attracting attention by our men becoming perverted to a passion for show and money and the pleasures of an idle life. But as with civilization around the globe, patriarchy, for as long as it could be sustained, was the key to maintaining population and therefore power. So this article, it documents the same cycle in other empires. And finally, he comes to modern day America, Europe, and even Japan. And here's his conclusion. Societies that are today the most secular and most generous with their underfunded welfare states, I love this, will be the most prone to religious revivals and a rebirth of the patriarchal family. He says, societies that are today the most secular and the most generous with their underfunded welfare states will be the most prone to religious revivals and a rebirth of the patriarchal family. The absolute population of Europe and Japan may fall dramatically, but the remaining population will, by a process similar to survival of the fittest, be adapted to a new environment in which no one can rely on government to replace the family, and in which a patriarchal God commands family members to suppress their individualism and submit to Father. Again, he says it this way, and I love this. Across the globe, people are choosing to have fewer children or none at all. Governments are desperate to halt the trend, but their influence seems to stop at the bedroom door. Are some societies destined to become extinct? Hardly. You ready? Listen to this line. This is from a liberal. It's more likely that conservatives will inherit the earth. Did you hear that? Conservatives will inherit the earth. Again, this man writes for a liberal think tank. So, for the record, a liberal is worried about conservatives taking over the world because of a low birth rate among elites and liberals and the fact that conservatives will have children and therefore take over. You maybe save the West, if you will, because Western civilization is built on patriarchy. And then the conservative or just kept going on and on and on about not having more children than you can afford. The liberal says patriarchy keeps civilization from collapse, large families. The conservative says you can't save the world by having children. What is it? Like, in this case, I think the far right has more in common with milquetoast George W. Bush, trying to abandon his principles in order to save the system and does nothing of the sort. You can't abandon the West to save the West. And in this case, it's the liberal who is right and more in line with Scripture. You can't believe everything you read on the internet, Abraham Lincoln, but you can believe what you read in the Scriptures. So what does Holy Scripture say about the family as the foundation of civilization and as for the conservative fight to win not just the West, but the world? Well, let's look at Scripture. Let's do some Bible drill, shall we? Genesis 1. Before there was an earthly king, before there was a constitution, Before there were institutions or elections, before there was right or left, before there was the West, there was marriage and children. You know, God didn't start with a city council. He didn't start with a senate. He started with a patriarch and his wife. Genesis 1:27 through 28. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. I want you to notice the order, because it's vital for this. And so first of all, what's the order? Well, we have God. Starts with God. God created, God blesses, and then he commands. God created, God blesses, and then he commands. Like if we even to start thinking about fighting for our nation, our civilization, fighting for the West, fighting for dominion, fighting to proclaim the gospel, fighting for Christendom, fighting for the church, I want to remind you that all this is downstream of who God is and what he has done. You know, I think it's easy for us to get ahead of ourselves, jump right into working and striving and laboring. And when we do that, like we start to sink. Like if we forget that this all starts with God, it all starts with God as our creator and then our blesser. Well, isn't it really easy to look at the darkness around us and all we can see is that? All we can see is the rage of the war while we're in the fog of war, and all we can do is react with fear and anger. If you will remember, the first article made much of the battle we faced. It also talked about the awakening of young, angry men. But you know what it didn't mention? Much about God. You know, if we're going to save the West, well, the West was built on Christianity. Yes, you have the pagans, Romans, and Greek laying some foundations philosophically, and early Christians kind of called them a pre-evangelism of the West. But West really comes into its own when Constantine and the rest embrace Christianity, and Christianity spreads, and that's what we have. Like, none of us want to go back to pagan West. There's those fake pagan dudes on the right that think they're really going to accomplish something. That's not Western civilization. That's Western barbarianism. I mean, we don't want to go back to that. But if we're going to do any of that, well, it has to start with what the foundation is, and that's Jesus. Jesus comes first. God is first. Right? When we take our eyes off the triune God, we fall into all kinds of errors, and we begin to lose heart before we even begin. And trust me, I've been there. You know, I saw when Charlie Kirk got killed. I was angry. I was fearful. Overwhelmed. I was pissed off. I was like King David in Psalm 73, which if you're ever just super angry and fearful or looking at the wickedness around you and feeling beat down and depressed, just remember the number 73 and 37, right? They're two Psalms, Psalm 37, Psalm 73. The subject's almost the same, and they are a balm to my soul. They are so good because David relates to us. David says in Psalm 73, I saw the wicked thriving and my foot almost slipped. You know, it's easy to look at the wicked abandoning family life and giving themselves to nothing but political activism, and then seeing them seem to thrive. I mean, you start to think like what we're doing is worthless. You can sympathize with the tall college student. Like, the wicked enter into politics. They got no family life. They become elites. A bunch of homos and fags become, different assistants and things in DC, and they worm their way in. And you can start to think, man, okay, you can't beat them, join them. David said in Psalm 73 that he almost gave up until he went into the temple. Like, his feet almost slipped. Like, he saw that they were mocking God and they seemed to get away. But then he did do something. He went into the temple and he reflected on who God is. We can't lose track that God sits in his temple. He laughs at the schemes of man. That God is our maker. And if we're going to be blessed in any battle, it will be because he is our blesser. He's our savior. He's our king. We get our marching orders from him. And we can follow them even through the shadow of death because we know he is good and true and the victor. God, start with God. Start with the fact that God's our creator, and therefore he is in control. We must answer to him, and we must do things his way. Start that he blesses, like without his blessing. And in our time, the blessing is through Christ. Without Christ, we are sunk. And because he creates and because he blesses and has rescued and redeemed us, then he commands. And then we follow this command. And then notice the order of his commands. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and then rule. Like that's the order. Fruitfulness first, ruling last. Ruling is downstream from fruitfulness and multiplication. In other words, family precedes civilization and politics. I would argue family is not a hindrance to dominion. It's the means of dominion. You cannot fill the earth with disciples without children. You can't subdue the earth as isolated bachelors. God did not give the Great Commission to a bunch of warrior monks. When Jesus went up on the mount, he gave them to fathers. The disciples had wives and children. And that Great Commission still goes out primarily to fathers and mothers who would train up a godly seed. The family is first. It's the first government. The first government starts before the children come. It starts with marriage, husband and wife. And it's from their union comes the seed. And it's also kind of vital that we get that order right. We have to get that order right in our homes. Outside of the relationship with Christ, in the home, marriage is the primary relationship. So even as I'm talking about starting a family and having children, I don't want you to think that children are higher in the priority. Children are part of the main purpose of marriage for sure. Like that's why we have marriage. That's why Adam needed a helper so that he can have children, take dominion. But the marriage came first. And children are the fruit of that marriage. Many people get this backwards and they have children and now their family is centered around the children. And mom and dad don't have time for each other. They don't protect. They don't the marriage, and the order gets backwards. And when the order is backwards, the whole family suffers. Again, the right order matters. God, then husband and wife, and then children. Any other order, and we're not talking about what will build civilization, but what will tear it down. Children made first is destructive to civilization. The wife above husband is destructive, and the husband above God is destructive. It's God, husband, wife, children, that order. And when that order is right, we have the family. And when we have the family, we have the first government. And if you have it rightly ordered, you have the rightly ordered government. As many theologians and churchmen have said through the years, the household is the first government, the first jurisdiction, the first place of authority. It's the first economy. In fact, the word economy comes from a word meaning household labor. Families are where work is done. So if your family is not a place where work is done, well, then, yeah, you're not going to get civilization building. Like, the family is not meant simply to be a refuge, but it's a place of labor. It's a place of mission. It's a place where it's the first school. Family is the first place of worship. The family is the basic building block then of both the church and the state. And both the church and the state rely on families. In fact, both the state and the church make their first appearance in this family with Adam and Eve and their children. And so to abandon the family in order to try to save the family, it doesn't work. To abandon the family is to abandon the blueprint of creation. And this is not just a pre-fall thing. After the fall, after Adam and Eve's sin, well, even after the flood, Genesis 9, 1-7, God again establishes the family as foundational. And he leads with the command to be fruitful and multiply. In fact, this is a command that has never been rescinded. Actually, Martin Luther said that this is more than a command. Like, it's more than a command in that it's hardwired into humans. Like, you have to really work hard to resist it. And even then, resistance is futile. What it means is God is hardwired man and woman with hormones and everything else so that they will have a drive to reproduce. Now, of course, there are a few people that God has gifted with the ability not to have children. It's a gift meant to serve him, and it is very rare. Like if a man is having lust In his heart, he doesn't have that gift. Now, he may be single beyond his own choice. It may be an affliction, maybe affliction for a woman, in which they have to rely on, trust the Lord, and be useful. But God does not give that to people to take up on themselves. Like, you don't take that gift for yourself, which is why the Roman Catholics are just ridiculous, trying to enforce that on their priests, their leaders. Because we're going to see here, like, leadership actually presupposes family life. In fact, that's why we call them fathers in the family, fathers in the church, fathers in the state. You can fight the urge to reproduce. You can take pills and all that stuff, but there's disastrous consequences, and it will still be there. It'll be twisted. It will be twisted into sexual morality, homosexuality. It could be twisted and used with abortion and murder. But the problem still remains, you were made to reproduce. So it's really more than a command, yet it is. Getting married, having children is foundational what it means to be a human. Anyways, moving throughout Scripture, we see the honor that God puts on marriage and family. 2 of the 10 commandments explicitly protect it. Honor your father and mother. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Again, going back to that honoring, the 5th commandment, that 5th commandment is foundational for all of social and political order. The Westminster Standards show us, in fact, if you ever, like, even if you're not a Presbyterian and you just want to study the 10 commandments, grab the larger catechism and walk through that and look at how it describes each of the commandments. And I think you're going to be convicted. I think you're going to be encouraged. I think you're going to grow. Like, as Christians, we could just spend our time going through that and striving to be obedient to the Lord in faith. But one of the things that shows on the 5th commandment is, like, this is not just about your biological parents, though it includes them, but it's like an honoring of all authority. And there's plenty of scripture passages that can point to, because fatherhood comes from God the Father, and he establishes it on all fatherhood. In fact, Ephesians, I think chapter 4, in your English Bible, it'll probably say, this is Paul, I bow the knee to God the Father, who gives his name to the families of the earth. In the Greek, it's, I bow my knee to the pater, that's father, from which the patria get their name. It could be translated as family, but it could also be translated as fatherhood. I mean, it incorporates the word father in it. And so family and fathers are like almost, I mean, they're intimately tied even in the language. And so God gave his name fatherhood, father, to fatherhood. And so this has implications for civilization for sure, and for civil government. Of course, elsewhere in Scripture, Deuteronomy 6, the home is made central for the education and cultural formation of people, as well as the covenant transmission of the truths of God. Like, we're to love God with all of our heart, soul, and mind and strength, and then do what? We teach our children over and over and over and over. This is civilization building.
In a world of compromise, we're committed to being men who stand firm in the faith. Men who lead with conviction, courage, and boldness. At Steadfast Cigars, we're not just here to make great cigars. We're here to ignite the kind of fellowship that inspires other men to lead well, leave lasting legacies, and build unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. That's why we're proud to partner with the Patriarchy podcast. So go to steadfastcigars.com, order some premium cigars, and enjoy them to the glory of God. Brothers, remain steadfast and hold the line.
This is how you build a nation. This is how God intends to do it. We also see that God gave civil laws that established that parents, in one sense, were the first line of law enforcement. Deuteronomy 21, 18 to 21, right? If you had a child who was disobedient and rebellious and constantly rebellious and abusive, you actually had a duty to go to civil magistrates who would at that time been made up of extended family, right? Like from the family came tribes and you know, clans and tribes, and the leaders, the fathers of those were the fathers over the government. And so you would take your rebellious, most likely young adult son who's constantly rebellious, and he would be put to death. Now, that sounds harsh to our ears, but really this is part of God's way of protecting his people. Like, we have a whole lot of young, rebellious young men who commit crime after crime after crime, and they get let out of jail after jail after jail after jail, and then they go on to murder somebody. Like, if we would obey this, maybe we'd have, well, for one, we'd be safer. Two, might be a little bit more fear of God in people. Also, God gave in the family or the tribe the responsibility to punish the murderer, right? That we had an avenger who was somebody in a family in the tribe, and when somebody committed murder, they were to hunt them down and take them out unless they can make it to a city of rest and prove that it was not intentional. But the point is, you can't have a nation of Israel in the Old Testament without families. It's clear that marriage and family is the basic building block and plan for extending a nation. And this continues in the New Testament as well. Jesus blessed the little children. But, all right, I have a feeling this 6'2" author would probably agree with a lot of this. Yeah, family's important, he might say. But he would have the question, okay, but my point still remains, just having too much children, it hinders your engagement in a political square. And, it's one thing for us to say that family is the basic building block of the state, but another to deal with the argument that a large family is an impediment to active political engagement. And there seems to be some natural wisdom to that. Like, if you're busy with a family, you're not going to be as engaged in the minutia. Like, this is why some homosexuals have been able to get in. They got nothing to spend their time on. And so you may need to argue, yes, our young men have to leave marriage behind, family behind, so they can engage in the political square right now. Okay, but what does the Bible teach us about those who should govern? And about the importance of children, like, not just as a basic building block, but ongoing. Well, let's look at Psalm 127, which I read at the very beginning. The passage that's about having lots of children, like about having cute little kids and how cute your little kids are. And when you got a big family, you put this on your wall, this verse, we have it on our wall to remind you that your kids are cute and you're blessed by their cuteness. And so you don't feel bad when things are tough. You remind yourself of all this, right? This is that point of that verse, like, blesses the man who has a bunch of cute little kids. But actually, that's not what it says, does it? First of all, at the very beginning, the part I didn't read, it says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. This is important to start off with. Again, if we don't start with God, we start with vanity. If we forget the Lord, then no strategy will ultimately work long term. We need the Lord's working with us. We need the Lord's working with us for something to work long term. One thing I'm reminded of is Joab in the Bible before I move on. Joab was a man that did action immediately, and sometimes it was useful, but ultimately he didn't get blessed because of it. And so we have to learn to try to do things the Lord's ways and see how the Lord wants us to obey. Psalm 127, read it again. It says, behold, children are a gift of the Lord. Well, there's the cuteness. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Okay, but listen to this part. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. He shall not be ashamed when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Listen to that. So that's not talking about cuteness. That's talking about, it's talking about battle, about fighting. Like arrows. Arrows are deadly instruments of war. You don't want an arrow hitting you in the heart. You're going to die. Like the children, it's not about the cuteness. It's about the fact that they are instruments of war. And then it says something about speaking in the gate. Is that talking about, you're outside, you got the front yard, you open up the gate, you're talking there, and people watch your kids in the yard. He's honored. No. Where is the gate? Well, the gate in Scripture is where elders sit. And why do they sit there? Because that's where the laws are made. That's where judges rule. In other words, it's where politics happen. So this whole passage is about war and politics, not sentimentalism. It's civilization building stuff. And God says the man with many children is the man who stands in those gates without shame. That means Children do not hinder public engagement. Children propel public engagement. Like, children, in one sense, are the qualification, not the disqualification. According to Psalm 127, the family is the launch pad for political authority, real political authority that's not shamed and dishonored. In fact, we see this again in Proverbs 31. The godly wife who takes care of the home and they have children. What does it say about her husband? Well, he can trust her. So this is a good use for a man to have a wife. He can trust her, and it says, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. Having a wife here isn't a hindrance, it's a blessing. Her husband sits in those gates. And in fact, because of her godliness, she herself at the end of this chapter is praised in those gates. Like, she'll be praised in the gates. Not that she sits in the gates as a judge, or she's to leave her home and now become some feminist boss babe, but rather all society praises the godly woman because her husband is now a great judge. Like, when a godly man in office is able to do his work because his wife is so cared for the home that, like, he has time to take dominion. This is what God created in the beginning. And this doesn't end in the New Testament either. Look what God's requirement for leadership in the church is. 1 Timothy 3:4-5. He must be one who manages his own household well. For if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? Or in Titus 1:6, having children who are not accused of dissipation or rebellion. In other words, the test for leadership in the church is children. Like, no children, there's really no ability to test his leadership. Now, this doesn't mean that a single man can never serve in leadership, but it tells you that the expectation is children. And not as a hindrance, but as a blessing. Now, they can be a hindrance. Unruly children, well, you failed the test of leadership. But a faithful home, well, you're ready for leadership. Notice again, God assumes leaders will be fathers. And so in God's church, he doesn't call men qualified to rule because they crushed some kind of campaign to become a leader, but because they catechized their children and led their home well. A man with well-trained children isn't disqualified from public leadership. In fact, he might be the only one qualified. And so, brothers, family is not separate from leadership and authority and from politics. In fact, it's politics rehearsed daily. Every bedtime prayer is really a liturgy of governance. Every chore chart is a lesson in responsibility and authority. Every spanking is a confrontation with law and justice. Every dinner table conversation is political formation. Listen, if you want a man who will stand strong before tyrants, you want to find the man who stood strong before toddlers. If he can't say no to a rebellious 3-year-old, how's he going to say no to our tyrannical government? And young men who are angry with no wife and no children, they don't have a resume for ruling anyone else. Again, it doesn't mean that maybe some of them are not called to get into this, but it's not an obstacle to winning the West to have large families. In fact, it's what should be expected because the Bible values generational power. Proverbs 17:6, children's children are the crown of old men. What are crown for? Crown are for kings. This is basically saying a man with grandchildren has royal power because he has dominion that endures beyond him. The scriptures are clear. So has been church history. Heck, even the pagan philosophers got this right. Even if they didn't like it, they got it right. Roman general statesman Quintus Cecilius Metilius Macedonicus in 131 BC said, if we could survive without a wife, citizens of Rome, all of us would do without that nuisance. He's part of the manosphere, right? He's part of the men going their own way thing. Like, if we could do without a wife, it would probably be best. But even he went on to plead with the Romans that they had a duty to marry and have children. He says, since nature has so decreed that we cannot manage comfortably without them, nor live in any way without them, we must plan for our lasting preservation rather than for our temporary pleasure. He was a hopeless romantic, wasn't he? Aristotle was better. He says the family is the association established by nature for the supply of men's everyday wants. When several families are united, the first society to be formed is the village. And then from there, we get into civilization. Cicero said, the first bond of union is that between husband and wife. The next, that between parents and children. Then we find one home with everything in common. And this is the foundation of civil government, the nursery, as it were, of the state. Early church fathers argued this as well. St. John Chrysostom said that through marriage comes the great benefits to both families and to the state. For there is nothing which so wields our life together as the love of man and wife. St. Augustine says that domestic peace, that is the family life, he says, is the well-ordered concord between those of the family who rule and those who obey. Civil peace is a similar concord among the citizens. He says domestic peace has relation to civic peace. In other words, civil peace models from family peace. No family, no large families, no children, no wife, no getting married and working hard. Well, what are you going to expect to have civic peace for? St. Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages said that the family is natural, and an even stronger sense is prior to political society. Civil authority depends on the pre-existing structure of family. Of course, we've already talked about Martin Luther, but Martin Luther and other Protestants helped rescue marriage and reform family life and brought with them great blessings on the West. There's this great book called When Fathers Rule, which showed how the Protestant Reformation made the family central again. And this brought peace and ordered liberty. You know, the Roman Catholic Church, and I get a feeling from reading that article that that dude was Roman Catholic. They had so down, many young single people were going off living in convents and monasteries, and like the birth rates were low. What was really valuable was celibacy and the priesthood, which also had some connection to civil authorities and stuff. Like, these are what really mattered. And so family life really fell into disrepute. But it was the Protestant Reformation that rescued them. In fact, they went into these places with nuns and rescued them, got married, and from there began to restore order and liberty and peace. It's the foundation for the American West, because America is an Anglo-Protestant nation. And Martin Luther would have a word with anyone arguing for not having children. He said this as only he could. I love this. He says, today you find many people who do not want to have children. Moreover, this callousness and inhumane attitude, which is worse than barbarous, is met with chiefly among the nobility and princes, who often refrain from marriage for this one single reason, that they might have no offspring. It is even more disgraceful that you find princes who allow themselves to be forced not to marry for fear that the members of their houses would increase beyond a definite limit. Surely such men deserve that their memory be blotted out from the land of the living. Who is there who would not detest these swinish monsters? But these facts, too, serve to emphasize original sin. Otherwise, we would marvel at procreation as the greatest work of God. As a most outstanding gift, we would honor it with the praise it deserves. Right? If we weren't depraved, we wouldn't have this problem. But they had the same problem then. These swinish monsters becoming elites so they can have power, and they'll die off. Cotton Mather, skipping ahead some years, in New England said, families are the nurseries of all societies. They're the first combinations of mankind. Well-ordered families naturally produce a good order in our societies. They're little commonwealths. And of course, this was well reflected in the founding of the United States. In fact, that became a very common phrase, little commonwealths. Our second president, John Adams, said this: the foundation of national morality must be laid in private families. In vain are schools, academies, and universities instituted if loose principles and licentious habits are impressed upon children in their earliest years. Years later, another United States president, Teddy Roosevelt, gave a speech. It's often called the Man in the Arena. I think Richard Nixon quoted part of that speech, which is an amazing part of it. But most people have only heard that part, which talks about, there's some people, they can only be cynical and they don't matter. What matters is the man in the arena giving himself, fighting and being bloody. Even if when he fails, he's still striving. That's amazing. It's very encouraging to actually get into battle. But most people haven't read all of it. And I wish I had time to read all of it to you. But I'm going to read some parts because it's just too good. He says the success of republics like yours and like ours means the glory and our failure, the despair of mankind. And for you and for us, the question of the quality of the individual citizen is supreme. He's saying, like, if our Republican fails, this is difficult for and brings like either glory if it succeeds or failure for mankind. It's disastrous, at least for us in our nation. And what matters most is the individual citizen is supreme. He says, under other forms of government, under the rule of one man or very few men, the quality of the leaders is all important. If under such governments the quality of the rulers is high enough, the nations for generations lead a brilliant career and adds substantially to the sum of world achievement, no matter how low the quality of the average citizen, because the average citizen is an almost negligible quality in working out the final results of that type of national greatness. So he's saying, like, if you got a king, well, if you have a good king, a great king, well, the average citizen doesn't matter as much. You can still have a great nation, you know. Maybe that's an argument for having a king. In our day, maybe that's where we're headed because of the lack of quality of individuals. But that would not be saving our heritage, our Western heritage, especially our American heritage. Like, that wouldn't save that. We live in something different. And this is what Teddy says. But with you and us, the case is different. With you here, he's speaking, actually, he was speaking to Europe, by the way, when he says you. He's speaking to Europeans who had some Republicans, and he says, with us in my own home, in the long run, success or failure will be conditioned upon the way in which the average man, the average woman does his or her duty. First in the ordinary, everyday affairs of life, and next in those great occasional cries which call for heroic virtues. The average citizen must be a good citizen if our republics are to succeed. The stream will not permanently rise higher than the main source, and the main source of national power and national greatness is found in the average citizenship of the nation. So for our kind of government, in which I think we want to maintain, is we need high citizens. We need citizens, the average citizen, to have high quality character. Like, if we really want a Christian nation in our system, we got to have high quality individuals. And so he goes on to talk about the character. And I would love it if our president would talk about this today. He says in particular, there are 3 everyday qualities that are needed if civilization is to survive. He says they are the will and power to work, the ability and strength to fight at need. Those are the first 2. The will and power to work, like to be hard workers, not be lazy, but to give ourselves to hard work. And then he talks about the ability and strength to fight at need, like a manliness, like we can't be effeminate men. We have to be strong in our bodies, our minds, and our hearts, and able to fight when needed, like to be able to go into battle. But there's something greater than that, something more important that he says. There's one virtue that is even more. This is him. I'm going to quote him. He says, finally, even more important than the ability to work, even more important than ability to fight as need, is it to remember that the chief of blessings for any nation is that it shall leave its seed to inherit the land. It was the crown of blessings in biblical times and is the crown of blessings now. The greatest of all curses is the curse of sterility. And the severest of all condemnations should be that visited upon willful sterility. The first essential in any civilization is that the man and the woman shall be father and mother of healthy children, so that the race shall increase and not decrease. If this is not so, if through no fault of the society there is a failure to increase, it's a great misfortune. Like, if it's not the fault of the people, yeah, it's sad. Maybe think of a real plague that would come and wipe out a lot of children or something like that. But then he says, if the failure is due to deliberate and willful fault, then it is not merely a misfortune. It's one of those crimes of ease and self-indulgence, of shrinking from pain and effort and risk, which, in the long run, nature punishes more heavily than any other. if we of the great republics, if we, the free people who claim to have emancipated ourselves from the thraldom of wrong and error, bring down on our heads the curse that comes upon the willfully barren, then it will be an idle waste of breath to prattle of our achievements, to boast of all that we have done. No refinement of life, no delicacy of taste, no material progress, no sordid heaping up of riches, no sensuous development of art and literature can in any way compensate for the loss of the great fundamental virtues. And of these, the greatest fundamental virtue, the greatest is the race's power to perpetuate the race. For Teddy Roosevelt, I think echoing scripture and everything else, like the family's foundational. He says the homely virtues of the household, the ordinary workday virtues, which make the woman a good housewife and a house mother, which makes the man a hard worker, a good husband and father, a good soldier at need, stand at the very bottom of the character that we need. And so, as goes the family, so goes the nation, so goes the whole world in which we live, someone once said. And this is absolutely true. You know, G.K. Chesterton marked, the disintegration of rational society started with the drift from the hearth and the family. If we want to save the West, it will not come by abandoning the foundations. It won't come by young, angry men refusing to marry and having children, refusing that. It won't come by an influx of singles into the political square. We've had enough of that, actually. A government made up of unrooted people ruling over an unrooted people is a government of perversity. When political power is concentrated in those with no children, you know what you get? Short-term policy caring only for the now. This is why the baby boomers who had so little children have done great damage. They were only thinking about the now. You get sensuality unrestrained by the future. Politics shaped by desire, not duty. And then you get our political class, which is more single, more sterile, more LGBTQ, perverse than any time in American history, and more perverse than the population they even rule. A ruling class without children has no stake in tomorrow. In that nation which they rule will have no tomorrow. If we want to win, you have to do the faithful things. You got to recognize that God uses faithful people doing the normal everyday things. And then when the situation calls, we rise up and we do extraordinary things too. But we can't win by abandoning our principles. What are you winning when you abandon your principles? This goes beyond having children. This is a lesson for all of us. If we abandon our principles, what do we win? Now, let me conclude by coming back to the article I read. Are there any truths in its claims? Could I steel man it for a second? You know, I think the author, being a young man, he has much to learn. But if I'm being charitable, he's striving to get at something he can't put his finger on. Like, in fact, if he's right-wing conservative, he may say amen to much of what I've said. So what do I think is he trying to get his head around? Well, I've spoken much about the centrality of the family. I've said it's important to have children, and I think you should have lots of children, and more than you can afford. Because if we're doing calculations that way, we always get the calculations off because we forget that there is a God who has his thumb on the scale in one direction. We don't start with God. God provides. I've told in other podcast episodes of God's provision in my family. A faithful man who trusts God and doesn't spend all his time making financial calculations on whether he will be faithful is someone God will bless. You know, there's a proverb that says a man who gives and he still gets more. Well, if you look at that as from a financial, like logical calculation, if I give all of my stuff, how am I getting more? It doesn't work. But when you calculate God into the equation, well, it works. And so this constant phrase of, well, having more children than you can afford doesn't make it easy. I'll tell you that. It's difficult. It can be. You may have to work hard. You may not have the time. It may take a while before you actually are able to engage in certain battles. But again, I'm trying to steel man this. So what then is the problem he's trying to get his head around? I think the problem that while marriages and families are central, and they are the way to save civilization, they're the only way to do that if we're faithful. They are not the way, though, if we are merely doing it as an attempt to live action role play Little House on the Prairie, right? They're not the way to victory if we just have lots of children out of sentimental reasons, and then we continue to go about living in the same ruts in the same way as the wicked. Like if we have a bunch of arrows, but they're dull, or they're bent, or they're crooked, or heck, they're aimed in the wrong direction, they're no use. A wicked family will not save any civilization. A wicked marriage will be no help. A marriage filled with strife and unfaithfulness is destructive. We don't need people with all the beautiful photos that are staged and carefully curated while their homes fall apart because they don't follow God. What we need are families that flow from obedience to God. We need men who are in the fight all the way, prioritizing lordship of Christ in their home, loving their wife as Christ loved the church, dwelling with her in understanding. We need homes where people repent frequently, where discipline happens, or children are disciplined, where you worship with your family in your home, where you catechize and teach, you educate intentionally, right? Teaching your children your faith, teaching them good politics, raising them to be curious, engaged, teaching them to honor the people who came before. It's not enough to have children and a wife. You have to raise warriors who will take the gate. And they raise warriors. Again, this is one element. A man who has children and has a godly wife, he then needs to take his family on mission. A family on mission is powerful. We need faithful families, and we need them over many generations. We have to be building. In 1877, a social researcher named Richard Dugdale, while assisting in a New York prison, found that several inmates, in fact, 42 in one prison, they all had a common great-great-grandfather. And he started to trace the family's lineage. He's like, this is kind of crazy. They're all 42 people in this prison and have the same great-great-great-grandfather. And so this great-great-grandfather was named Max Jukes. He was born sometime between 1720 and 1740. He lived in New York and basically was a bum, a drunkard, a womanizer. And he had 11 children with multiple women. And here's some stats for you on his descendants. 310 died in poverty, 150 were drunkards, 128 prostitutes, 60 were thieves, 150 various other criminals, and 7 were murderers. So this guy did have lots of children, but he was tearing down civilization. But after having compiled this data, Richard Dugdale decided to compare it to another man around that same time period with the same number of children. 11 children. One wife. This man was Jonathan Edwards, born in 1703, a Puritan, New England Puritan minister. Of his 11 children, he began to look through their lineage. Of his next 5 generations, here are the stats. 13 college presidents, 65 college professors, 75 military leaders, 80 public servants, 60 authors, 60 doctors, 30 judges, 100 pastors, 100 lawyers, 3 United States senators, and 1 United States vice president. Every man loves the movie Gladiator, and one of its most popular quotes is what we do now echoes in eternity. Brothers, I think we have this idea that real faithfulness is always found in facing down savage hordes and wild beasts and tyrants. And you may not have to do that, though you may have to, actually. But you don't have to do that for your actions to have epic consequences, either for good or for evil. The arena of your battles are in yourselves, your own hearts and minds, and in your own households with your spouse and your children. The work that we do when we have faith is not in vain. Our lives might be a vapor, but our labor in the Lord is never in vain. So brothers and sisters, if we're going to fight and win, you gotta do it God's way. We can't have young men going their own way and abandoning the very thing that's foundational. Now, I know I'm going to hear and get pushback from, the women are terrible. And then for examples of that, they will point to real terrible women that have OnlyFans and all this and all that, as if those are the only women out there. I have a church. We've got daughters in our churches. We have godly women. You might point to statistics and say women have done this and that. And yeah, and it's bad. It's very bad. And I'm not trying to downplay maybe some of the problem, but on the other hand, you know what they say about statistics? There's lies, and statistics, damned lies and statistics. That is because who are you going after anyways? Are you going to go after those worldly women? Why not go after the godly women in your church? Well, they won't have anything to do with me. Are you just an autistic dweeb? Or are you a young man working hard to improve yourself. Heck, even the autistic dweebs get married in my church. Like, you can get married, you can have children, and then you can work different jobs, and you can go to the city council meetings and stand up and speak. You can go and speak before governors. You can, heck, still run for office, which I don't know if you know this or not, but we've never had a single unmarried president or vice president that I'm aware of. Certainly not in modern times. There are very few single unmarried people in Congress. Like, even our liberal system understands this. So young men, you can do it. Like, you can get married, have children, build the home together. It can happen. You can just do things. If you have faith, it might take hard work. It might take labor. It's not cosplay. It's not LARPing. We don't need young men doing that. For one, that's also not attractive to women either. I've seen some young men in conservative churches trying to dress like they're still Little House on the Prairie or something. Like, dress well, look nice, but like, recognize we're not also Little House on the Prairie times. Like, give yourself to fighting today's battles. In today's battles, you need a wife and you need children. So, well, brothers and sisters, this has been my encouragement. Whoever's listening, I pray that this does encourage you. You should get married. You should have children. And if you already are, you need to raise them in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Again, not enough just to have children. But don't give up your principles in order to try to win your principles. It doesn't work that way. Be a principled man. Do what works. At the same time, be faithful. Now, if you enjoyed this podcast, you think it was helpful, please like and subscribe to it on iTunes, Spotify, wherever podcasts may be found. It's also on YouTube. If you haven't been watching the videos, you should go check those out. My helper here, I have a guy named Chris Mix, works at our church, does all of our sound and tech stuff, and he does a good job editing these and adding good video quality and making it really good. So like us and subscribe to us on YouTube, share, check out our sponsors. By the way, I call them sponsors. They're not really paying, but we do want to point you to good people. So like, we have some good cigars. You like to smoke cigars, check out Steadfast Cigars. If you like, well, if you want, we definitely can use some sponsorship and help with Sovereign King Academy, which is our school here at Sovereign King Church. So if you got some extra resources you can throw to help us, the link will be in the description as well. All right, brothers. Well, I hope this has been helpful. But until next time, let's build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarchy.